Today, we're diving into how a series of intense crises totally shaped the energy infrastructure of Russian cities. It's a really fascinating story of what we call path dependence, where these emergency solutions, things born out of pure necessity, ended up creating these long-term legacies that would define an entire era.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to trace this whole story through 5 key phases, starting with the massive shock of the First World War, a moment that completely rewired the nation's energy future.
You see, the war didn't just mess with fuel supplies. It actually politically rewired the entire energy sector, and in doing so, it set the stage for decades of challenges to come.
So when war breaks out in 1914, this powerful wave of nationalism washes over the country, and it goes right for the heart of the electrical industry. Why? Because the sector had huge foreign ownership, especially German ownership, and that suddenly became a massive political liability.
And what's just incredible is how fast this all happened. We're talking about key companies that powered major cities being seized practically overnight. Their assets were just handed over to local governments that, honestly, were often completely unprepared to manage something so complex, especially in the middle of a war.
So to deal with this chaos, the state steps in. It creates this powerful new body, OSOTEEP, which basically centralized control over all fuel. And by 1917, its power grew to include electricity itself. Suddenly, local needs didn't matter as much as the needs of the state and the war.
And as you can imagine, this top-down control created huge problems on the ground. There's really no better example than the city of Pskov. Its power station ran on wood, and it got caught in this perfect storm of shortages and insane price hikes.
Just let that sink in. The cost of their main fuel shot up nearly 10 times in just 7 years. This wasn't just some budget problem, it was a genuine threat to the city's ability to even keep the lights on.
So Pskov is desperate, right? They're looking for any way out of this mess. And they come up with this really smart, forward-thinking plan. Build a hydroelectric station on the nearby Velikaya River. This would have freed them from the crazy fuel market for good.
But of course, the central government denied the request. With the war going on, there was no money, no support for a project like that. And that single decision trapped Pskov. It locked them into depending on that expensive, hard-to-get local fuel. It's a textbook example of a path being chosen under pressure, a path that led to a really inefficient future.
And if you thought things were bad during the war, well, they were about to get a whole lot worse. The revolution and the civil war that followed led to an almost total collapse of what was left of the country's energy system.
We're talking about a level of paralysis that's hard to even imagine today. Power stations just went quiet. Big cities were plunged into darkness. The entire national rail system even had to stop running passenger trains for almost a month in 1919. It was a total breakdown of the system.
And what's so interesting about this period is this huge paradox that emerges. The modern, high-tech stations that ran on coal and oil, they failed because the trains couldn't get the fuel to them. But the so-called low-tech stations, the ones burning local peat and wood, they turned out to be way more resilient. They weren't efficient, not at all, but in a crisis, they were the only ones that were reliable. There's this quote from an editor at the time, N.N. Sukhanov, that just nails it. He said, "Before the revolution, the bad transport system caused fuel shortages, but after, the lack of fuel is what broke the transport system. It was this vicious cycle, with each crisis feeding the other, spiraling down into total collapse."
Now, you might think that after all that chaos, the new Soviet government would hit the reset button, right? Start fresh? Well, they didn't. Instead, they did something kind of remarkable. They took all those crisis-driven, improvised solutions from the war years and turned them into national policy.
So that makeshift strategy of relying on local peat and wood was now the official way forward. The state nationalized all the power plants and basically ordered a focus on building small-scale stations that ran on local fuel. The path that was chosen in a moment of crisis was now set in stone. But you guessed it, this new path came with a whole new set of massive problems. People were so desperate for electricity, they were making these dangerous, illegal connections to the grid, which caused constant overloads. The equipment was already worn out from the war and couldn't be replaced. It got so bad the state started prosecuting people for theft of public property just for trying to get some power.
And the story of the Cherepovets power station is a perfect snapshot of this reality. The whole system was just barely holding on. It struggled with constant breakdowns, fuel shortages, and was only running at about 60% capacity, all while losing money. This was the real-world consequence of the path they were on.
Okay, so fast forward to the 1930s and everything changes. The state's goals got way more ambitious. And suddenly, the narrative completely flips.
All those chronic problems with the power grid, they weren't seen as technical failures anymore. Now they were seen as political crimes.
You have this moment, a speech in 1930 by Gleb Krzyzewski, the head of state planning, and it is a terrifying turning point. He gets up and publicly blames the grid's deep-seated problems on specific engineers, accusing them of deliberate sabotage.
And that speech? It was like a starting gun. It kicked off this brutal campaign of political purges. What had been accepted government policy, like building small local stations, was now twisted and reframed as a deliberate act of wrecking to undermine the Soviet state. A wave of arrests and show trials swept across the entire energy sector.
And this is where things get just bizarre and terrifying. Engineers were suddenly being accused of the very practices that were official policy just a few years before. Pushing for small local stations? That was now called predatory fuel use. The path that was chosen out of pure necessity had now become a road to the gulag.
So what's the big takeaway here? What does all this tell us? Well, the entire story is this stark, powerful lesson in how the decisions we make in the past can really limit the choices we have in the future.
It all comes back to this idea of path dependence. That emergency turn to local fuels during World War I locked the Soviet system into a very specific and ultimately very inefficient technological path. It was a path it couldn't easily get off of, one that ended up shaping its economy, its politics, and the lives of its people for decades.
And that leaves us with a really big question, one that's just as relevant today as it was a century ago. It's a powerful reminder that the choices we make in a crisis, the quick fixes, the improvised solutions, can echo for generations, becoming the locked-in problems that future societies are left to solve.